Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us for this webinar. We really appreciate you being able to come back this week because we did have some technology things happen last week. So we really do appreciate you kind of staying the course with us. We're really excited to talk today about teaching student development through a critical lens. This is part of the NASPA on-demand series that's focused really on faculty. And this year we took the approach to focus on kind of the civically engaged faculty and various ways that manifests both in the classroom, in our pedagogy, in our research, and in our service. And so throughout the series, we focus on different aspects of that. And so this is really the theoretical component to the series. And so Reggie and I put together this presentation and are really excited to have you here. So I am Dr. Amy French. I am an assistant professor in my third year of tenure track at Indiana State University. I also coordinate the Student Affairs and Higher Ed program at ISU. And so that is my second year coordinating the program. And that we're going to go into a few details, I think, in a moment regarding how we come into theory and kind of the courses that we teach on theory. But for now, I wanted to just kind of introduce myself and allow Reggie to do the same.
Yes. Thanks, Amy. So my name is Reginald Blockett. Reggie is fine. And I'm a first year assistant professor at Grand Valley State University. Prior to joining the faculty at Grand Valley in the tenure track line, I was a visiting assistant professor at the University of Connecticut and had some wonderful experiences there. I'm a newer faculty member, but I feel like I have been thinking about, talking about, realizing, actualizing student development theory for some time. I have worked in various capacities in student affairs, primarily in residence life, where I feel like I was able to kind of actually put this work into practice. Over the past 2 years, having teaching theory, I've really adapted to and have always kind of been considered myself to be a critical scholar, a critical pedagogue, and really have been able to put some of those things into practice. So as Amy mentioned, I'm excited to kind of share a little bit more about some of my experiences in the classroom when it comes to teaching from a critical perspective.
Absolutely. So we would like also to know who's in the room, and so we're gonna do that in a moment. And before we do that, I do want to kind of, I guess, walk you through kind of what we're planning for our session today. Offer some learning outcomes, current trends in student development theory, strategies for teaching theory as a criticalist, and then hopefully engage in some group discussion. And so we would like to know, maybe in the chat box, or if you'd like to come up on the screen and introduce yourself just briefly and let us know what you're most interested in regarding this session and maybe where you're coming from in terms of student development theory.
Don't be shy.
Hi, I'm Dina Neese. I am the program coordinator and assistant professor for the College Student Affairs program at the University of West Georgia. And I'm not currently teaching student development theory, but I would like more information on how to integrate a critical lens into that.
Great.
Nice.
Hi, this is Carrie Taylor from the University of Connecticut. Hi, Reggie.
Carrie.
I am an assistant professor in residence and program director here, and I am teaching the college student development theory course. I'm interested in, thinking about how to incorporate critical perspectives while still helping students understand the foundational concepts.
Thank you.
Mitch Nasser. I'm a assistant professor and program chair for higher education at Lindenwood University in St. Charles. And it's awesome to kind of see everybody on here and kind of put some connections to emails that have gone back and forth. And my main interest is I went to a session a few years ago with faculty members discussing the continued importance of student development theory and how we teach student development theory while including the social justice components and paying attention to marginalized groups. So just interested in any topic related to student development theory and the best way to instruct it. So thank you for doing this.
Excellent.
Hi, it's LJ Shelton from the University of Arkansas. I'm joining on the phone, so I'm not sure you can hear me, but I'm very excited to hear about this topic for student development theory, which I teach, but also to infuse a critical lens throughout all my courses and work.
Nice. Thank you. We heard you very well. Anyone else interested in introductions? There's some folks also been using the chat box, and that's completely fine as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Wonderful. Well, we're so glad to have you here. So our learning outcomes for this session are threefold. And Reggie, you can, I'm going to let you slides, but I'll take the learning outcomes here. Our three learning outcomes are to help attendees will know the current trends around student development from a critical and post-structural paradigm, gain insight into teaching strategies that disrupt fixed notions of student development theory, specifically beyond foundational works in the field, and also understand the imperative to teaching student development theory to diverse student populations in grad prep programs.
Awesome. So I just wanted to reiterate too that that second lesson outcome or learning outcome for our session today around being able to move beyond some of the foundational works. And I appreciate hearing even from you, Carrie, about what does that look like? What does that mean? And so I actually wanted to kind of start with that as we talk about some of the current trends. One of the things that we're realizing in the field is that there's a need to, not move away from our foundational works around student development theory, but to expand and extend our capacity around what other theories and what other modes of thinking are kind of arising in the field, especially as we're in a place and time culturally, historically, and social politically, where students are needing to have various types of representation, and students are coming to college and experiencing various types of developmental issues that sometimes far beyond exceed what our foundational works kind of situate themselves in. 3 years ago, Alyssa Abies and a number of collaborators wrote an edition of the monograph or the monogram New Directions for Student Services, and that special issue focused on critical and post-structural perspectives on student development theory. One of the big things that a number of the contributors to that text offer in terms of where we ought to be going, where the field should be moving, is talking about these various waves in student development theory. And so they talk about Susan Jones and D.L. Stewart talk about these various waves. This first wave of theory where our foundational works have kind of really situated themselves. We won't rattle off all these different theorists, but we know who our foundational works in student development are: the Carol Gilligans and the Arthur Chickerains and Linda Risers and all of these different folks who have offered up very poignant and timely perspectives and frameworks for how we think about and work with college students. The second wave of theory has kind of, in some ways, moved beyond the foundational works and have incorporated various social identity groups in terms of how we think about theory. So moving beyond just thinking about the cognitive, the psychosocial, the moral, and even some typology works, but thinking about and theorizing about the experiences of queer students, for example, or the experiences of racially minoritized students, or the experiences of gender minoritized students. So the second wave of theory has, I would say this probably came around in the 80s or so, that has really kind of pushed our field to think about various social identity groups, but it hadn't really thought about those perspectives from a critical framework. It was more so thinking about holistic approaches, things like self-authorship, right? oftentimes situated in constructivist and even still some post-positivist frameworks. Now, there was some, probably some bits and pieces of works that, examine student development theory from a critical perspective, but Susan Jones and D.L. Stewart say that it wasn't until this third wave, this more contemporary moment that we're in student development theory, that we really kind of, not just from constructivist frameworks and paradigms, but from critical and post-structural, and incorporating critical and post-structural theories and perspectives. So these stage models, I think, is always really important, and I break it down to my students when we're talking about student development theory as well, because I want them to understand, the kind of lineage of where these theories come from. And this third wave, it really kind of focuses on and centers on marginalized students, on marginalized collegians, right in the center. So it's these are frameworks that are thinking critically about some of the foundational works that we've covered. They're thinking critically about social identity work. So not just solely describing some developmental patterns when it comes to various social identity networks and communities, but also kind of going a step beyond and thinking about how do power structures play a role in how students are learning and even showing up in college? How do issues around privilege and oppression and marginalization show up, and how are they carried out? How do they impact student learning? How do they impact how students understand their social identities? And so one of the things that I would say is also kind of a current trend is a number of scholars are really interested in moving us to thinking about how we might teach through an intersectional analysis, right? And this past December, Dr. Jessica Harris and Dr. Lori Pan-Davis published an article called Undoing Intersectionality in Higher Ed. And they really kind of focus on some of the pitfalls that we sometimes fall into in higher ed research and teaching and practice when it comes to the work of intersectionality. They talk about, that our field has kind of been notorious at different moments in history for using particular frameworks and concepts as a buzzword. And so intersectionality has become a part of that as well. When I think about the work that goes into teaching from this kind of critical perspective, I really do situate with my students the importance of intersectionality, multidimensionality, and anti-deficit frameworks. And so I think that those are really good contributions to thinking about how we might push our field and kind of move the work in terms of teaching student development theory. Finally, I think one of the areas that I've been kind of most interested in concentrating my efforts around as I've been teaching student development theory now is how do we think about both micro and macro intervention strategies when it comes to working with our college students, right? I'm teaching a course right now that is, I call it kind of Theory 2. The course title is Strategies in Student Development. This intervention strategies course is meant to really help students think about the practical implications of student development theory. They oftentimes start at a very micro level, maybe even a meso level, and thinking about individual relationships, interactions with students. Maybe they're thinking about how they might apply frameworks or perspectives to groups of students or to working with in advising capacities. But at this macro level is really where I've kind of pushed my students to think about, and this goes beyond the kind of individual interactions that we're having with students, those interpersonal pieces, and really thinking about implications for policy, implications for institutional context change, right? Institutional implications for social change. And that's been something that I think, when I think about the kind of current trends in our field, is a struggle that some of us have. How do we teach this paradigm of critical perspective, but still make it practical for students? Our field is notorious for thinking about meeting students where they are, and that's critical, but also being able to kind of push them a little bit more and challenge them to think beyond the interpersonal interactions with students and thinking about how we might employ and strategize or employ strategies of student development that are beyond the kind of typical. So I'll let Amy take back over.
So when Reggie and I started planning this session, we thought it was really important to provide kind of that that underpinning for the way that we see and view theory in our teaching, but also to hopefully make it to you all, to give you some to utilize within your own courses. And so I thought it would be important, it would be good to share kind of my pedagogical approach in teaching theory, and then share some specific tools ways that whether through class exercises or through specific assignments to really incorporate what Reggie just talked about, particularly regarding that meso, micro, macro approach to theory. And so I come from a very student-centered approach, grounded in social justice and really rooted in that dialogical approach. For me, teaching theory, just absolutely, it's essential to have conversations and connections and establish that safe space for dialogue without really wrestling with ourselves and with one another through that conversation. I find it sometimes difficult to grasp those concepts, whether at the foundational level or in this third wave that we're in currently. I find that it really allows for that personal and professional reflection. And even with the PhD students that I teach at Indiana State, a lot of times they come into the classroom having already had student development theory in their master's program, but when they come into the PhD program, they don't expect as much, personal reflection. And by the end of the course, they're really kind of blown away at how they can really take some of those skills and incorporate that into their work with students pretty readily. And so that's something that I think is really beneficial, and I think stems from that dialogical approach and that focus on reflection. And lastly, I really try to connect all that I do to positionality, privilege, and oppression. I think without talking about those things, we're falling short of truly the dimensions and dynamics of theory, and I think what the power of theory can do in our field. And lastly, the notion of practice, really incorporating what we've learned and who we are and what we espouse as professionals into the work that we do in the profession. So I identified 5 key kind of tools that I use in the classroom, again, whether specifically as class assignments or through course exercises, that really allows that student-centered focus that provides space for that dialogical approach and that reflection. And so the first thing that I've learned is absolutely just wonderful and kind of a beautiful representation that allows the course to kind of come together by the end, is allowing students to put together a cajita box. I don't know if you all are familiar with Rendon's work entitled Senta Passante, but the notion of the cajita box is really a sacred space. It's a personal space, and it allows one to really kind of ignite within themselves who they are and what they represent in a manifestation beyond themselves. And so with the cajita box, but there are specific requirements that I, of course, have to implement as the instructor to ensure that they're really doing that reflection. And so I require that they place 5 things in the box, and they can decorate the box and incorporate anything within that box that they want that really represents who they are. But they do have to identify at least one privileged identity group, one oppressed identity group, and then 3 additional things that really help them in describing who they are within their personhood, within their professionalism, etc. And that has really become a very powerful piece. I've used it both in the on-campus courses as well as distance. And I find that students take that very, very personally to identify ways to represent themselves and connect with theory. And what I've done I've tried it a few different ways, and I always have them share with the class their cajita box. And so, walking through the various components, explaining what the meaning is for them, and then how that really builds into their positionality, whether as a privileged identity, as an oppressed identity, and then what that means for who they are as a professional, and potentially for the larger conversation regarding advocacy work and things of that nature. So that's just been a very beautiful assignment that was actually designed by Dr. Mary Howard Hamilton, and has just really been a phenomenal kind of way to engage on a personal level with the students. Case studies, I'm sure everyone here in the discussion today uses case studies in some capacity. What I've done with student development theory is I actually have designed 5 or 6 case studies that really present a myriad of situations for students in the case. And I provide, it's about, again, 4 to 5 cases, 2 different groups. I divide the class into groups, and they'll start with a case, and they discuss the case on a very deep and meaningful way, actually before they've even read any of the texts on theory. And so they talk about how would you respond to these situations? How would you engage with the students? And then about 3/4 of the way through the semester, I reintroduce the same cases. And by that point, they've engaged with the literature. They've started, wrestling with some concepts and engaging in dialogue. And their responses are very deep and rich in ways that they can identify the theories within the case. So they may be identifying those foundational theories. They might be identifying the psychosocial development theories, intellectual, moral development. But then I also push them to engage with the critical components. And so that's one particular assignment that allows them, I think, to really start somewhere at the very beginning and then see how much they've learned by about 3/4 of the way through the course, and kind of it helps build confidence in them, in their ways that they can articulate and define the theories, as well as respond to or not the theories. And so, and you can respond to the cases in a wide range of ways, but a few of them I sprinkle in with some notions that, again, maybe an intervention might not be necessary, but as a student affairs professional, there still may need to be some response on some level. And so that's kind of the case study component. With storyboarding, I tried something new this semester, again, because I teach in 2 different platforms. I teach both in a distance platform as well as on campus, in the traditional setting. I wanted to incorporate technology in a unique way regarding theory. And so I really focused on that digital representation of reflective practice. And so Robin presented a few different elements and components to do that she recommended. And so I really kind of took that and ran with that using Adobe Spark, and allowed the students to provide visual representations of what their understanding of the theory would be. And then I had them share those storyboards with their classmates. And so the storyboards just continue to grow and build. And by the end, when we went to the case study assignment and the cajitas, they were able to say, oh, I remember Joe had a storyboard on this particular theory. And so they were able to capture that through photo representation and pictures. It really allowed them to, again, explain, articulate, and connect to the broader conversation. Many of the students I found also connected to current events in that particular assignment, which I thought was really fascinating because that wasn't a direction that I was expecting them to take. But I thought it also really demonstrated their ability again, be able to implement and incorporate broader conversation regarding the critical lens that they were being able to infuse throughout. Next, I developed, well, I didn't develop, I guess I have the students develop theory critique worksheet. And that idea came to me through the text, the Pat Nettle text. And that's where Nethelkamp and Patton both kind of provide some different to those who are reading theory in ways that they might engage in the scholarship and engage with the theories. And so instead of creating the worksheet myself and giving it to the students, I have them talk about how they're going to do the theory as they go. And so some of the things that they've come up with each year, it's been a little bit different in their approach. But I find it helpful, and I try to restrict it to about 10 points for the students, because that makes it achievable and kind of something that they can do as they're reading the theory. and trying to connect with the theories. But a few of the questions that are usual are how is the theory developed? What are the theorists' backgrounds? What is the historical or socio-political context? How might the theory generate ideas and new knowledge, of course? What student populations does this theory apply to? How might privilege and oppression and power shape or be shaped by this theory? So those are just some examples that the students have identified based on Nefelkamp and Patton to really start critiquing that theory. I've seen students print off the worksheets and fill them out weekly as they're doing readings, and I've seen them really reflect that homework even in later courses. And so that's been something that's been great to see the students being able to, again, have that tactile approach to the theories, to write on their worksheets, develop their kind of worksheet book, so to speak, and then carry that with them into other courses, particularly as they develop their capstone projects, their research presentations, and things of that nature. And then lastly, one assignment that I've tried a few different ways is an assignment where I have the students work in groups to create theory. And I would be very interested in a conversation about maybe some of you who have tried something similar. But I've based it on Abes's article that's on the theoretical borderlands, using multiple theoretical perspectives to challenge inequitable power structures in student development theory. And I use that because Abes really does a phenomenal job of helping us as scholars to consider the dilemmas of that intersectionality and pairing various even contradictory theoretical perspectives together, right? To consider the political representations, the personal, the professional, and really kind of trying to find that dynamic way to navigate this theoretical space as we move through the third wave and maybe even into a new space. And so that's something that I've really kind of toyed around with and played with in a few different ways. And it's really amazing to see what critical perspectives the students bring into that, both in the ways that they place themselves in groups, because I for that assignment, I let them pick their own partners or groups and see the ways in which they navigate that theory development. I have found that with the master's students, there's a little more kind of scaffolding that I do as the faculty. And for the PhD students, I almost have to dial them back a little bit. And so, again, to make sure that they're really focusing on that unpacking the theories and relying upon theory, and while also developing theory to move into that new space. So that's a lot of talking from Reggie and myself. And so we thought it would be beneficial because, again, as we knew we would have a dynamic group of scholars in our session. And so we're really excited to have you here because that's totally exactly what we're hoping for and expecting. And so we would really be interested to hear what some of your strategies are that you've utilized to infuse a critical approach into your classroom. What's resonated with the students most effectively? Were there some pitfalls you've encountered? That's the first question I'd like us to kind of reflect on as a group.
There's been some really good conversation in the chat box as well around strategy. Mm-hmm.
So as I drive the ship with this, I can't necessarily read the chat box, and so that is unfortunate. But I'm gonna let you manage that part, Reggie.
Yeah, well, so one of the it looks like this is Dean Squire, who's talking about this storyboarding is one of those various strategies, and interesting to think about how you can use storyboards to help students reflect on how their identities have shifted or developed differently and similarly over different times. And then depending on the given context, whether it's in an online presence, an in-class person, or, in in-person, face-to-face class, thinking about some of the different strategies that might come from a project like storyboarding. I can share and tell you that those projects, the strategies that you mentioned, Amy, as we've talked about, I've always felt have been very strong in terms of getting students to engage in the material. The Cajita project by Laura Rendon is a project that, dates back further beyond her work in Cinta Passante, but I think she really kind of highlights how that project is a contemplative practice and really helps students in that self-reflection that you talked about, that you shared. I was fortunate to have her as a faculty member teaching the class on Cinta Passante right after that book had came out. And, that project, that experience is just so emotionally driven. It is one of those experiences that really helps you to question and confirm, right, who you are, parts of your identity, and really thinking about, like you mentioned, Amy, how do you really situate within this context of privilege, oppression, and marginalization. And so I can't just highlight enough the importance of a project like that, the Cajita Box. I've also done interviewing techniques in class. I have students doing an interview project right now. I could talk more about that, but I'll stop and I'll see what other strategies folks have thought about or already are currently implemented in their courses.
So, Reggie, I'll pick up on the interviewing project because I use a similar project where I actually ask students to start with creating a theory before they ever really look at any other theory, as a way for us to start to think about the context in which theories are created and the socially constructed nature of theories. And so it's a little bit challenging in the sense that sometimes they really want to dive into, the existing theories, but I've found that if I'm explicit about why I'm asking them to start sort of in a very inductive way, and let them know that we are going to get to the existing theories, that they will sort of come along with me.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I like that. I think that's important too, to get students to even, I always start the first couple of sessions with, what is theory? What is the uses of theory? What is formal theory and how is that different than informal theory, right? So I can imagine that a project like that, having them do some sort of theory creation early on would for sure help them to at least start situating themselves and thinking about what is this whole thing about theory? How is it so impactful in terms of thinking about describing and explaining phenomena or behavior, right? Thanks for sharing that, Gary. One of the things I can share too, so this conversation about foundational works, some programs have, the space and ability to kind of have, 2 theory courses or multiple theory courses, even beyond 2, where you may be covering, foundational works in one course and/or, what some programs kind of packages like multicultural or diversity kind of course where there may be some frameworks around social justice and equity. Some programs are, like I said, kind of condensing those things. I always like to help students understand, and I always like to actually start my courses with the foundational works. Even those of us who choose to use the third edition of the Student Development Theory text, the Green Book, one of the green books in our field. What I've found is even in that text, it's situated, it's kind of set up where social identity theories are up front, and they really kind of focus more on that kind of critical perspective. And then the foundational theories are later in the book. I still teach my course with covering foundational works up front. And I do that because I think it's important for students to understand the types of theories that there are, number one, and number two, the purposes of those theories and those foundational works and how we kind of get to a point of understanding some of the kind of more deep connected pieces around equity and justice. So for example, when I'm teaching students, what is it called? When I'm teaching students around cognitive complexity, helping them understand how critical it is to learning and realizing what are these various modes of cognitive complexity, how does context impact cognitive complexity, how do students, come to understand cognitive dissonance. That's important for me because that's kind of lays the foundation for when we get ready to kind of jump into social identity theories. And I typically start with, the reconceptualized model of multiple dimensions of identity. And I think that's important. It helps them kind of make that jump in understanding. Here is how this foundational work impacts what we're talking about in social identity. And then we're able to kind of move on to other critical frameworks like intersectionality, or like talking about critical race theory, or critical, last night in my class, we were covering disability studies. So we're talking about critical disability work, right? Helping students understand all these things do build on each other. And it is important to kind of, cover the groundwork first, for me at least. I know some people may differ in their approaches to teaching the courses. So.
Yeah, and Reggie, I've tried it a few different ways in teaching, starting with the critical lens and dialing it back, but then also starting with foundational theories first. And particularly, I found with the master's students, it's because often it's their first introduction to theory, being able to kind of the concepts of even the stage models is helpful for them to start kind of understanding what we're talking about when we're talking about theory. Whether formal, informal, I start there, but then once they're able to kind of see theory in those kind of that Chickering model, of the vectors, then we can start moving and I can start playing and massaging that into that kind of more fluid approach by the time we get to queer theory. If I've introduced queer theory and postmodern theories earlier in the semester, a lot of times it creates some confusion and it's harder for students to think as critically because they're truly trying to grasp the concepts. And so that's been my experience with the master students, with the doc students, again, depending upon what programs they're bringing into the PhD program, really kind of is contingent upon how far we go and where we start. But that's been my experience with that. So what about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Hey everyone, this is Jamie Workman from Valdosta State. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was having issues before, but apparently I'm on audio now, so that's exciting. I was wondering, maybe from some of the more seasoned educators on the call, has anyone taught out of both the second and the third editions of the Green Book, or maybe even the first edition? Because I will say, when I first started teaching theory, it was like the last year the second edition was out. So I taught it once with that kind of structure. And now I've taught it 3 times with the new version, edition 3. And it was just this past fall that I felt like we had some kind of roadblocks. Like, I began to think about what you were talking about, Amy, in terms of maybe I should flip this and go back to the structure that the second edition had with the foundational, what we call the foundational theories first, because I felt like starting with identity was almost a little bit too much. And I teach first year master's students. We're a master's only program, so a lot of them are coming from not what you would consider a traditional student affairs-y type undergraduate experience. So I was just wondering if folks have perspective on that. It sounds like both you, Amy, and you, Reggie, have done it successfully, going out of order in the new book, but I'm just wondering if others have perspective.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Jamie, for sharing that too. And I'll share some things, and then also I'm looking at so Dean is having some hard times with the mic, but it's have a pretty active conversation here happening in the chat room. I want to make sure I'm able to engage that too. It's fascinating. I think we're in a point, in a moment where there's a lot of pros, cons, and indifference about the use of the textbook. And it's funny, no secrets at all. Dr. Lori Patton Davis was my dissertation chair. A number of the authors on the Green Book, I've connected with have close collegial relationships with. But I recall, working with Lori when they were going through the process of redoing this third edition, and really wanted to make some, what our field would probably consider radical decisions by putting some of the social identity works and frameworks up front. I think it's pros and cons. They start out by saying in that text right off the back that, even though we situate these chapters in this way, you can teach this, however you so choose. There are things that have been taken out of the most recent edition. You can still choose them, choose to teach them from other editions. For example, typology model. There's pretty much no typology works in the latest edition of the student development text. One of the things I experienced this fall when I was teaching theory, the kind of theory 1 class here was, and this was my second time teaching this course. I taught a semester at UConn as well on college student development. I realized that students were relying too heavily on memorizing stages and steps when it came to the foundational works. And that sort of drove me crazy at times, to be honest. And solely because it goes against the whole framework of teaching from a critical perspective in itself, right? If students are solely memorizing stage models and things like that, I'm looking at some of the chat conversation, Dean Squire has mentioned, he does not use the green book, the student development theory book. A number of faculty that I've had conversation with choose not to, or they may choose to use bits and pieces of it. The text that I started out with talking about, what my students affectionately call the red book, which is the monograph, the New Directions for Student Services on Critical and Post-Structural Perspectives, is a good, it could either be an alternative for some people, or it could be a good supplement. And I personally use it as a supplement in collaboration with the green book. People are doing that, I think, and even Dean's talking about it, because it allows, it does kind of critique some of those things. And by critiquing it, students are learning, okay, here are where, some of the pitfalls fall into place. I also want to say real quick, I don't want to take up too much space and time, but there is something to be said about teaching foundational works from a critical perspective as well, right? So it doesn't have to just be this, monotonous kind of teaching of this material and expecting students to kind of either memorize or constantly reflecting on some of these same foundational works. I had a conversation with D.O. Stewart back in December, and D.O. said, you could choose to, and what D.O. does is chooses to teach that foundational works in like 2 to 3 weeks. And so that's kind of the time we're dedicating to that. The rest of the time is doing some other things. So there's a number of different ways that folks have chose to engage. Textbooks, I'm teaching this Theory 2 class right now. All I'm using is articles. I'm not using a textbook at all because I figured, you had a textbook, you got comfortable with it, and now I want to see that you can actually grapple with the research article and not just espouse what the theoretical framework is, but what the implications for practice might be by way of those work. So just kind of a quick piece. I think that people are choosing to engage those texts in various ways, and I think that's okay.
Thanks, everyone, both those of you talking as well as those on the chat. Helpful to kind of read and listen as everyone goes through what they're doing with that.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing, that I'll add to the conversation is, I think it depends on where you find where are you most comfortable in sharing the theories and critiquing the theories, and in what ways, right? Because I think as scholars, we all bring different lenses and different positionalities to our work. And so how do we engage in these conversations and these dialogues with our students who, again, bring their own positionalities and identities into the conversations? And so, one thing that I address pretty much right out of the gate in the beginning of classes, we're going to approach all of these theories from a critical perspective, and let's identify a way that we're going to critique them. And again, I know in the back of my mind where I want that conversation to go, but really helping the students to kind of develop and craft their own, like I said, like the worksheet, so that they can become a part of that conversation and engagement. But I think, if I'm not comfortable with the focus or the organization of the course, then my students are going to feel that as well, right? And so that's, I taught the Green Book from start to finish once, and then I moved into a different way approach. And it's actually, it's not like I start in a certain place and go, it's very scattered. And I just tell the students, trust the process, trust me, we're gonna really have an engaged, dynamic class, because we're going to use these readings in this text along with supplemental materials in a dynamic way. And so that's kind of that's something I think sometimes, sometimes I know that I forget that I may have learned it a certain way, but how then do I want to share that knowledge and share kind of where I've come even throughout my evolution as a scholar is important to capture. So let's go ahead, in the interest of time, let's move to the, because I'm all about some triumphs. So what critical triumphs can you share that will inspire us to continue doing this work? I love the aha moment. Students say, oh, I didn't know I was going to learn this in this class.
Well, I can share some here. One of the things that I'm looking at from some of the pretty robust conversation in the chat the chat box is around students being able to critique work, and that being a big triumph for some folks, like what it means for students to be able to kind of find and think about what are the issues that are taking place, or what are the challenges that a theory is not addressing. And I think this kind of goes along with that assignment you mentioned, Amy, around the theory critiquing worksheet. Having students really kind of identify what things are, who's not being represented, or what perspectives or frameworks are not being represented. Dean has shared a number of different articles and citations that are, thinking critically about foundational works like self-authorship, right? At its kind of peak in our field, it is and it still is a very much hallmark work, a holistic approach to thinking about college students, tying in the cognitive theories, the psychosocial theory and social identity theory. But what some folks find is that it and its espousal, it kind of either misrepresents or doesn't fully represent some student identity groups. And so even things like that, I think, have been a triumph for me, thinking about how students themselves can critique and analyze theory. I had a student just last week, who we were talking about sexuality and sexual identity development. And, this was a topic that for this student was just very new, was something that was at times a little challenging to kind of get their head around. And by the time, we ended that class session, the student had approached me and asked, I want 2 or 3 more, articles or readings that I can read about this topic, because they had realized, this is so much more dynamic than what we've kind of talked about in the larger societal context when we talk about sexuality, that there is so much more dynamic pieces that are involved in students' sexual orientations and sexual identities, right? So, I think even having those moments with students where they're able to kind of approach us and say, here's what it is that I'm learning, those for me are always, I know we've accomplished the goal when that's happening.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I can share one that just happened yesterday in my class. So I asked students to find a developmental story from a book, a film, a personal communication, sort of something out in the world, not within a textbook, that discusses development. And So just to see them be able to make those connections, I think is really exciting. And so, talking about everything from the Gilmore Girls and This Is Us to Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, and Michelle Obama's Becoming, to be able to see the application of developmental concepts and, what students see as sort of their day-to-day life. Because I think oftentimes it feels very artificial when we keep it contained in the classroom.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Carrie. And I know Dean has been really active in that conversation too, about thinking, making sure that our approaches to student development theory aren't always solely centered within the context of higher ed research, right? So helping students understand that, there are larger societal contexts that we can be thinking about in terms of developmental behaviors, right? I loved reading Becoming, because I'm just thinking, it's pretty dope to kind of see how Michelle Obama's life have evolved to get to the point where she is now, where she has been and where she is now. And all those different points that have, kind of impacted her along her line. I love that assignment idea, Carrie. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, and a different take to that, Carrie, that I've taken is to have the students start off the class, ask the students where they saw theory this week, and just have anyone any of the students who may have seen or experienced theory to share that with the class. And at the beginning of the semester, sometimes there's crickets, or there's one person that says, oh, I think I might have seen, and then they'll share the story where they may have seen a student experience a certain particular aspect of a theory that they read about yesterday. But by the end of the semester, it's almost, I almost have to stop the bus and say, okay, y'all, we're all having those light bulb moments. And so I think that's something that is really great for me to see, but also I think it builds confidence in the students' ability to acknowledge theory in the day-to-day, in their day-to-day interactions with students, with their friends, within themselves. It's just kind of those small aha moments, but to kind of open it up for discussion at the beginning of each class, it kind of gets them kind of wrapped in to the theoretical mindset in a way that's not as, maybe scholarly or intense, but by the end they've got that confidence as a scholar to engage in those theoretical discussions. And I think that's something that's a triumph that I've encountered that I think is pretty nice, that throughout the rest of their courses, throughout the program. All right. Well, wonderful. I think we're getting pretty close to time here, so I don't want to go beyond our time frame. But I do want to say thank you all for attending this session. I hope it's been beneficial for all of you. I know Reggie and I really enjoyed putting it together and getting to work alongside one another in these discussions and in doing this theoretical work. We've got I think you all probably know where to find us, but here's our information. If you would like to reach out, feel free to do so. I do want to call attention to our next NASPA webinar, which is going to be on March 21st at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. And Dr. Brenda McKenzie is going to lead a discussion on practicums and supervision that I think will help us all as scholars in grad prep programs to help foster that experiential learning from our lens as faculty. So thank you all so much. We have recorded this session, and so we will be submitting it to NASPA for closed captioning, and then once that process is completed, we will make this available on the NASPA website. So we'll make sure to disseminate that information. All right. So thank you all so much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you all. Hope to see you at NASPA.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome. You all have a good day.